They were the inspiration for some of the most iconic horror villains of all time: Silence of the Lambs, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Psycho. This is the Butcher of Plainfield. Today, we're going to be talking about Edward Theodore Gein, and this is the Nightmare Hour podcast. Hey, Eric, that was my cold open. Did I do a good job?
I think I thought I was listening to NPR. That was amazing. You're like Terry Gross. This is amazing.
I did some. I woke up. The first thing I did today was I woke up and I listened to another story, a serial killer podcast, and what they were going to talk about. And then I read a whole bunch of biography stuff online, and then I kind of pieced my own story picture of this psychopath. I've never really dove into the. Well, I'll preface by saying I'm not entirely that interested in serial killers, but I've never really looked at this one. He's one of the most popular. I've always just heard his inspiration for these iconic villains.
Mm-hmm. I love serial killers. I'm obsessed with it, and not because of the gore and stuff. I just really find it interesting. Like how
you're a student of human nature, I think.
Yeah, and it is, and I don't believe in people being born evil. So I love the study, like the show Manhunters. I've read books and stuff, and I really love that show just because it does humanize it. Like there are like traumatic events that these killers have in common. Like there's exasperating conditions and variables that can create this like completely mentally ill, destructive, terrible human being. And I find that interesting. And I think, I don't know. Yeah. I don't want to get too far down the killer hole here. Ew,
well,
that sounds bad.
we've never properly done a serial killer episode.
Mm-mm.
So we've mostly done supernatural stuff. And so, we when we started this podcast, we did say it was going to be like a weird hybrid of all these things. And we've kind of just been on the horror movie proper, or horror movies proper kind of subjects the last few months. So we thought, it's Thanksgiving. Why not talk about the Butcher of Plainfield, which is a fascinating name to him, because when we talk about what his story actually is, I don't know if that title actually fits, and some of the inspirations are interesting too.
I don't really know where that came from or why that's stuck, because it doesn't really it doesn't apply. There's very little. I guess the woman they found, like the reason he got caught, she was treated very butcher-like, so maybe that's why, because she was all splayed out, like meaty. This episode disclaimer too, it's going to get kind of graphic and gross because that's what he is. So
that's what, unfortunately that's what serial killers do, is graphic gross stuff. So
can we make that movie, graphic gross stuff?
Yeah, the true story of Edward Theodore Gein.
Should be Gain, by the way. I'm upset that he pronounced his name Gein. Like everything about the English lane, like EI is an A sound, right?
Ein, yeah. Like when you think Einstein.
Gein. Right? Or it could be Gein. So it should be Gein.
I don't know. I'm not
English is strange.
I need to take more of English classes to have a proper conversation here. So today, this is going to be a 2-part episode. The first part is going to discuss the Ed Gein proper and who he was and what he did and his life. The second part is going to talk about the impact these murders and him as a person had on pop culture and some of these iconic villains. It's been a long. We haven't done a 2-part episode in quite some time, so I guess this is the perfect time to do it. I'm gonna start, unless you wanted to. I was gonna start by setting up who he was. And then we'll kind of keep this loose a little bit. We don't want to be super dry, especially when we're talking about such, was it, dark, disturbing and gross?
Gross and graphic.
Gross and graphic.
And gross.
Yeah. The characters. So we'll keep it a little, we'll mock this motherfucker to the grave or whatever.
You mean to do that pun?
Yeah, I did. Okay. So here's who he was. Here's who this living. Well, he's dead. This piece of shit. Spoiler alert, he's dead.
He died on my birthday, by the way. Spoiler alert. Wow. I saw that. Yeah. He died on July 26th. So happy birthday to me in 1984. So I would have been Oh no, I can't do math that fast. Like 7 or 8. I would have been a young lad. Didn't even know who Ed Gein was.
Um,
I'm sure it was a good birthday.
so Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We have some
Hmm.
connections to La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Yeah, I believe
Hmm.
so. I think we have people that live in that general area that we know.
Yeah. He was born on August 27th, 1906. So even if he didn't die prior to today, he'd be super dead of old age because, no one lives
Super
to
dead,
that'd
not
be
kind of dead.
114.
Yeah.
Anyways, he was born to an alcoholic, kind of a worthless, per everything you find, father and an incredibly domineering mother who taught her son that women and sex were evil things. He was raised alongside of his older brother Henry in the isolated farm of Plainfield, Wisconsin.
Th-
Um,
That is, but not to interrupt, but like color commentary. That is one of the things that a lot of serial killers have in common is like domineering parents and abusive parents, and just they get, yeah, like physically and emotionally abused from a very young age. And I also find it like a lot of these stories have like women hating mothers, and I find that really interesting. Like these women telling these boys how terrible women are. Yeah, that just doesn't quite click in, the rational part of my brain, but it's very interesting.
yeah, it is kind of strange. I think that there's a lot of commonalities. I mean, I always like complain in terms of like characters and writing. If you want to like make the most cliche villain, you do Rob Zombie's Halloween and how he
Yeah.
portrays Michael
Yeah.
Myers. But in a way, like you're gonna see Ed Gein has a lot of
Hmm.
those vibes, and although I guess in that one the mom was kind of the only sympathetic character in the household, but she was also a prostitute, and yeah.
No, she wasn't a great mom. I don't remember her being like real supportive or around,
No,
but
but she was more
so
sympathetic than anybody
yeah.
else in the house. But
Well, the dad was like full on terrible. Yeah.
yeah, so his mom's name is Augusta, and she was a very religious person. I believe she was raised or raised him to be a strict Lutheran.
Hmm.
But she had an incredible deep content for her husband, and because she was so religious, she would not get divorced from him. So they
Well,
stayed
he was
married.
an asshole, right? Like,
Yeah,
by all accounts, like he was an abusive, like terrible person, right? His dad.
who was but a failure at everything, and partly due to his alcoholism. But he just seemed very weak. I mean, Augusta really ran this household,
Hmm.
and she actually owned and operated a small grocery store, and she purchased a farm on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin, and that's where Ed Gein's existence will forever go forward from this time on.
Hmm.
And so she did it out on the outskirts because she didn't want outsiders um, dictating and basically influencing her son's opinion on the world.
Right.
Um, and she held them in the farm. They worked there. The only time they were allowed to leave without her was to go to school, which
That's
is just a
strange. Like usually, like if she's that controlling, you think she'd homeschool as well. Like, but
I mean, and I think maybe she did. They don't really talk too much about the church they went to, so I'm curious if because it talks about her preaching to the kids quite often and reading from the Bible every afternoon. And she'd read, the old. It was, she's Lutheran,
Old
so she
Testament
Old
stuff. Yeah.
Testament, and
Like
she would focus.
brimstone,
Yeah,
angry God.
an angry God. Yeah, an old angry God, and she would focus on these graphic verses. But she would preach about the evil of drinking and the belief that all
Hmm.
women, except for herself, of course, were prostitutes and instruments of the devil that were there to harm her sons. And so she
Hmm.
really painted the picture that women were, by all accounts, the devil's work and to avoid them at
Yeah.
all costs.
Just imagine what that do to a little person's brain. Is like a woman telling you how terrible women are. Like, I don't know what that would do to you. Like,
I mean, well, and then to be imagine being the father who's just, I guess, like he would just have to be this weak drunk to just not care. Like I just can't. While she's saying all these things, what is going through his mind? Does he even care? Is he, they don't really paint the picture of where he is, what he's doing. So maybe he's in
mhm,
town a lot of times at the bar.
right?
I don't know, but it's you're already getting a sense that young Ed is not being raised in a good household.
Yeah, not a lot of love there. I don't think. Not a lot of nurturing.
but he's got school, right? He's able to go to school and have all the friends and stuff. But unfortunately for Ed, he's he's a thin, gangly boy who is very awkward and is the target of many bullies at the school. Classmates and teachers claimed that he had interesting, off-putting mannerisms, like he would just laugh and seemingly laugh at someone told a joke. And this is where you get, Joaquin's Joker performance apparently has influence from Ed Gein. Um, and he was scolded by his mother whenever he was trying to make friends, which is just, again, like, so he has a steer clear of women. He's got a stick in the house, and whenever he's trying to make friends that aren't bullying him, he's yelled at by his mother for trying to be a person. So he's just put into this,
Yeah,
horrible
you know,
box.
his socialization lessons are just all wacky. Like there's nothing going well here for him.
So by the time he's 34, so he graduates school, he was able to somehow complete it, doesn't go to college, sticks at the house. Um, there's kind of, I couldn't really find much from like high school up until this point, but I'm guessing they're just also doing like farm work and kind of just general chores. But
Yeah.
George, his dad, dies of a heart attack in 1940, making, so this is when he's 34. So Henry and Ed begin doing odd jobs to help their mom with expenses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by all accounts, everyone in the community said that they're reliable, honest, and hardworking handymen, and that's kind of shocking given what is to come. But Ed also, not outside of his handiwork, he babysat for most families, and that was like a love of his. He would actually take the time and like play with the kids and laugh and get along with them, kind of like a clown almost.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, I
very
see. Yeah, and later on, like when things go awry, there's like one of the people who testified like weird stuff going on. They didn't think about at the time was like a 16-year-old boy that he hung out with. Like he seems, I don't know, maybe he,
childlike, right? Which
yeah, like maybe he identified with children since he never really was allowed to be one. He was just like scolded, and I don't know. It's interesting.
So his dad's died. His mom is much older at this point, but although she's not, she was a very young mother, I will say,
Mm-hmm.
early, because when she passed away, I think she was only like 60 something.
Yeah, I don't think in the early 1900s was not a time when you waited around to get married and knocked up as like
Yeah, you're right.
something you're supposed to do real
Well,
fast.
yeah, I mean, I guess they would have gotten a divorce, so presumably they might have been together since they were like, they might have been their first loves or high school relationship and
Right.
had a kid really young. Um, so on, so that's just kind of the picture. So he still didn't have a lot of friends. It's just him and his brother and his mom. They go into town, and now he's socializing a little bit more because he's babysitting, he's doing handiwork, but he's just kind of keeping to himself, and his older brother Henry's kind of running the show for their work. um, and that takes us to May 16th, 1944, almost 4 years after his father passed away of a heart attack. They were burning away marsh on their farm, which is common for end of the season. And the fire got too close to their house, and they tried to put it out. And then at some point they were separated, and then Ed couldn't find his brother, and put the fire finally got out. And then the police came. Well, he reported that his brother was missing. The police and a search party put together, and they tried to find him, and Ed led them directly to his brother, who was dead on the ground. um, Weird things though, because his brother was laying on an area that was untouched by the fire.
Mm-hmm.
He had bruises on his head, and
Mm-hmm.
seemed to kind of be like, "Oh, I don't know how I just led you to this,
Yeah.
body
That's
and
the
this."
part, like, that's the part that got me. He was like, "My brother's missing. Let me show you where he is." Like,
Yeah,
that
and
doesn't work.
the coroner says that the cause of death was asphyxiation. Asphyxiation. Got it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
nailed it.
yeah, first time. And yeah, so they kind of were, the investigators thought maybe there's some foul play and maybe he was at fault, but because the coroner's report, they didn't really have anything to charge him with. So we don't really know. Maybe he killed Henry, maybe he didn't, but Henry's dead at this point. So now it's just Henry and Augusta, living in
You
this
mean
little
that?
farm.
You mean Ed and Augusta?
Oh yeah, yeah. And they're living in this farm, and he's kind of the breadwinner of sorts at this point. And a year after his brother passed away, a year and some change, his mother passed away after a few months of strokes. And he was quoted saying he lost his only friend and true love, and he was absolutely now alone in the world. So that's his mindset. And at this point, he's, almost 40,
Yeah.
living at home on this farm in the middle
And
of
that's a
winter alone.
that's a weird phrasing too, calling your mother your true love. Like that's not normal. Like I understand what he's going for, but that's not a normal way to phrase that. like,
That's not right, sir. So he's still at this time doing odd jobs. It didn't say he's babysitting still, but I'm guessing like all of his work for this 10-year period is about the same. But the weird thing he decides to do after his mom passes is board up the house. So any room outside, so he basically confines himself to this room off of the kitchen and the kitchen itself. Everything else is boarded up. So he
yeah.
just has like a small apartment now.
Like,
That's fucked up. Like just a
Yeah.
weird fucked up thing to do.
I just saying, like Ed should have gotten some therapy at this point. Like he should have called someone up and like, I'm not feeling good. I'm boarding up house. Like,
Well, no
I don't
one
know.
to call, like.
Well, and it's also what 1940 something. I don't even know if
There's
therapists
no
did
phones.
anything. Yeah, they might just like do like a lobotomy on them, like say,
I mean,
"Good
maybe
day, sir." Yeah,
yeah. I
there's
mean,
no
that
mental
was
health.
yeah. You're talking early psychiatry at that point. So
There's, like
I don't know if,
leeches. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know. But he's trying to. There are comments at this time that he is like he's talking to people more often. He's saying some interesting, weird things that are off-putting. I think we both ran to different parts where he's talking about his interest in this World War II vet that decides to become a woman in Sweden, I think but he was fascinated by it, and he would talk about it to a lot of people that and his interest in becoming a woman starts to basically grow. Now he's at least what I can tell, he's never really talking about sexual things. He's just talking about like his interest in being a woman and becoming a woman, and specifically this case where a man became a woman and had a sexual reassignment surgery, and his fascination with that.
Yeah, and the other sources framed it more. They didn't argue that that was true, but it framed it more the sense that he wanted to be basically inside his mother, like if that makes any sense, like physically embodying what his mother was and to become that. So just depends on which way you're coming at that.
Which I guess like it's possible that she was basically raising him to only believe that she was the only good person in the world.
Right.
So that I guess that would make sense. Like if that's the only person he loves and trusts and can care about.
Well, and if there's that permanence of death and wanting to bond with that only person who like you knew, basically, like that taught you that they're the only good one and that you're the only one looking out for you and stuff. When they're gone, you're gonna do some wacky things to try to connect with that same thing because you can't trust anyone else because that's what you were taught from birth. So, not to say that like transitioning, if that's what he identified as, that's not wacky, but like if it was based on that like mother thing, then that's not a healthy way to approach it at all. That's not a healthy coping mechanism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, not at all. Okay, so this takes us to Ed's turn, and this is where the murders happen, his fascination with corpses, everything you probably know about Ed Gein is in this part of his life. Or at least I think the things that I kind of knew. Now, what I didn't know is that he only killed, because we don't know if he killed his brother. It's like alluded to, but he never admitted to it. He only admitted to killing 2 people, and there were only 2 confirmed victims.
There's lots of other theories, but yeah, only 2.
Yeah. I'm going to let you get into the theories.
Okay.
I'm going to take this first victim. First of all, everybody, their names are very Plainsfield as fuck. I mean,
is that the sequel to Graphic and Gross?
Yeah, Graphic and Gross and Plainsfield as fuck. So Ed is now gonna be, by the time he kills this first person, he is, what would he be, 51. So on November 16th, 1957, Plainfield hardware store owner Bernice Warden disappeared. And the only suspect they had was Ed. Warden's
Yeah.
son told investigators that Ed had been in the store the evening before the disappearance, saying that he would return the following morning for a gallon of antifreeze. At sales, they had a receipt for the gallon of the antifreeze,
Which
and
was
it
the
was
last thing. Yeah. The
that she,
last
yeah.
transaction.
So yeah, the breadcrumbs were there pretty quickly, and
It's a
they
small
were,
town. It's like,
yeah. I mean, like,
yeah.
you got
Yeah.
15 people that are suspects.
And this, yeah,
And this guy
exactly.
bought yeah, he left a receipt there. He was,
Let's start there.
yeah, seems like
Detective
the,
work.
yeah, like I mean, it is good, I guess, good on the police that they were able to quickly find this, because who knows what would have done after this. It might have been an American Psycho kind of murder in the streets type of thing. But they go to his property and they investigate it, and they find Warden's decapitated body in his shed, hung upside down by ropes at her wrists with a crossbar at her ankles. The torso was dressed out like that of a deer. She had been shot with a 22 caliber rifle,
Ugh,
and mutilations performed after her death. So when
God.
they searched the house, they found, and this is
Here's the
where,
graphic and gross stuff.
well, that's the beginning. So that's a very ritualistic like approach to this.
And I think
But
that's where the butcher stuff has to come from, right?
yeah, I think so.
Because imagine, yeah, ugh, I'm just trying to imagine. I know they're police officers and you see things because you're, working with crime. But imagine walking into the barn and that's what you see. Like, so far beyond anything imaginable. It's just, ugh.
I mean, the population of Plainsfield today is 897.
Exactly. So you know everyone or know of everyone. So they probably knew this woman. Oh, and Ed, but
So yeah, I mean, I'm guessing like in this time, there's probably, I don't know, hundreds of people, 300 people,
yeah.
like in the whole area, maybe 500 people. So there's such few people that when something happens, it's not too hard to figure out who it was. And he lives, in the outskirts of that town, so he's even further away from people. But when they searched the house, the authorities found 4 human noses, whole human bones and bone fragments, 9 masks of human skin, bowls made from human skulls, 10 female heads with the top sawed off, human skin covering several chair seats, Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag, Bernice Warden's head in a burlap sack, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, skulls on his bedposts, organs in his refrigerator, a pair of lips on a drawstring on a window shade, a belt made of human female nipples, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. They were photographed by the crime lab, and then all of the property was destroyed, because why the fuck would you keep that for anything?
Do you just should what? I don't know. Do you bury that stuff again, like out of respect, or do you just
I think
burn
you
it?
just burn it, just
You
never
just
look
like,
at it again. I mean, it's because it's already been. I mean, he's already done so much. I don't know. I don't think you need to. I just,
well, I guess at that point, I mean, besides the heads, ew, graphic and gross. Besides the heads, there's really no way to identify who they belong to. Like you have a belt of nipples, you can't really trace back the nipples and put them in the right spot from the grave robbing.
So I didn't really find too much about Mary Hogan.
I didn't.
She was
Me
a
either. Like no one is. All I found is that she was like she was reported shot and missing, and then he like confessed to it after that they found him with this second woman. So
yeah.
she'd been missing for a while, which is kind of nuts as well because, like we said, it's a tiny little place. You think they could just go house to house and be like, "Hey, mind if we look
So
around?"
I guess I can give you some backstory on Mary. Here's a little bit. She was 51. She owned a tavern in
Mhm.
Pine Grove, Wisconsin. Ed had been there to the tavern several times. Um, on the December 8th, 1954, so this has been 3 years prior to Bernice Warden. He waited for all the customers to leave. When he walked into the tavern, Mary told him that she was closing up. He said nothing and just walked over to the side of the bar. Before she could speak, he had pulled out a 32 caliber pistol, put it to her head, fired a bullet through her skull, killing her instantly. He took her body out on a sled, out to his sled he had put outside before killing her. It took him several hours to drag Mary's body back to his farm. The next day, police
And
found
no one
the
saw
bullet
anything.
cartridge. No, they found the bullet cartridge that matched the 32 caliber pistol. They also found overturned furniture and a pool of blood behind the bar. Took them 3 years to identify Ed Gein as the killer
Because he
because they never
confessed,
found
right? Yeah.
they didn't find her body until they searched the house for Bernice Warden.
Yeah. And
And
her
then
head was there.
he confessed yeah, because he immediately confessed once they basically came and confronted him.
Yeah, he seems very calm. Like when you go through everything after this, he seems very calm and shruggy about all of this. Like, what are you gonna do?
Yeah. So this is when okay, so they found all this shit, the stuff. And they found these two, middle-aged women that were just shot, which is also kind of a weird way because again, like in my head, I was like, I always thought this guy was like I guess because he influenced like those movies. I think he was like a lot more violent than just like he shot one with a rifle and he shot that one point blank with a pistol.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what he does to the corpses, which
Yeah.
is really fucked up, and that's where we get into right now. So when questioned by authorities, he says between 1947 and 52, so years before he even murders anybody, he made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to local graveyards and exhumed recently buried bodies while he was in a quote daze like state. In about 30 of those visits, he said he came out of the days while in the cemeteries, left the grave in order, and returned home with nothing. But what he would do is he would dig up graves of recently deceased middle-aged women that he thought would resemble his mother and took them home. He would take off their skin and tan their skin before he would make this furniture, these masks, or these suits that the police later found. He admitted to robbing 9 graves, and he led investigators to their locations, which they had to confirm that he did indeed take these bodies.
Right.
So they actually dug them up and confirmed that the coffins were empty. Um,
Did you ever wonder like why he didn't do like get his mother? Like, did that develop later? Like like for everything I've read, he didn't like raid his mother's grave and take her home.
yeah, that's kind of weird because yeah, I mean, that's strange that he went through all this work to basically emulate his mom without actually just taking her own body. But he wanted, again, like it's what I found is that Ed wanted to have a sex change, and he created this woman suit, is what he described it as,
Mm-hmm.
so he could wear it and pretend to be a female. He said he never had sex with the bodies because they quote smelled too bad. Um, yeah, but there were neighbors actually later on, like after his mother passed away, that he would hang out with, and one of them was a 16-year-old whose
Mm-hmm.
parents were also friendly with Ed, and they attended baseball games with him and gone to movies together. They reported that they were aware of the shrunken heads that he had in his house. And like they even joked at one point that asking if one of the rooms that was boarded up when they were at his house is where he kept the shrunken heads. He laughed and he said, "No, they're in that room." And he pointed, and that was one of the rooms that actually did have body parts in it, which is just like, okay, what?
I mean, what do you like? I hope that 16-year-old was able to find some therapy because how do you process that? Good God.
Yeah, I mean, so he's just doing these horrible things. He's grave robbing. He's saying he's in this dazed like state and just appearing in cemeteries. And that goes on for years before he kills somebody, and then continues after he kills people. But he's just living in this house of macabre. Um, I mean, it's truly insane. Like I don't know if there's really been anybody quite like this. When you use skinning like humans and tanning the flesh and sewing it and creating masks and furniture and like just the weirdest stuff. Like, what is the inspiration for that? It's just
I, I don't know. That's just it's so interesting to me is because from my belief, from what I've read and what I've researched and stuff, is that there's not, I mean, there are like chemically things, strange, like people are born with certain mental illnesses and stuff because chemistry in their brain and the way their brain synapses are aligned and stuff. But no one comes out and just is this. There's so many variables that happen, like combination of mental illness and abuse and trauma and stuff. It's just like, how does a human being get there? Like
yeah.
it's crazy.
I mean, to this level, I mean, you can kind of, I mean, we know that his upbringing was pretty poor, um, but to see it go to this level, you know, there's,
Yeah, like I'm assuming his brother was not this way. Like, I guess his murder. It's just so like, yeah, it's so strange. Like there are people who live through abuse and live through domineering mothers and fathers and abusive mothers and fathers and abusive caretakers and stuff, and they don't become this. And it's just it's fascinating in the most like disturbing and dark way that this happens. And I do think it's important. I mean, yeah, it's not like to get too like up like universal here, but like it's just important to like study this too. Like people shirk away from it and taboo away from it, and I understand that it's disturbing and graphic and gross, as we said, but it's also kind of important, I think, because like he didn't have access to mental health and mental wellness and all this stuff because it wasn't really a field yet. Like I really think it's important to learn from these people and like try to support and like avoid this when we see children that are in this like danger group, because this is the result of, in my opinion, like a result of like complete societal like lack of support for these kids who go through all this terrible shit, and then they become these monsters that do terrible shit. And that's the third entry in our book, like graphic and
yeah.
gross and plain-filled as fuck and disturbing as shit.
Yeah. Well, speaking of disturbing as shit, before we get into like his trial, I do want to talk
Yeah,
about the statements from the sheriff, Arthur Scalia. I think his name is Arthur Scalia.
that's plain-filled
Um,
as fuck.
I mean, yeah, so he's he's called to, he gets a warrant and goes to Ed's house
As
in
you do.
search of Bernice. So when the sheriff gets there to search the premises, he walks into the dark house. He's he's kind of fumbling along, and he brushes into something hanging from the ceiling. He says he turns and he touches the object, and it was a naked human carcass, beheaded and disemboweled and hung upside down from the ceiling. He gagged at the sight, but did not throw up. The carcass turned out to be the freshly gutted
That
remains.
means he totally throw up if that's his
Yeah, for sure.
statement.
Yeah,
Like,
he absolutely threw up on the corpse.
Yeah.
And he said nails had been hammered through each of her ears and tied together with twine, as if the readiness for her head to be hung up as a trophy. He called back up. They spent the entire night and the next day going through the house and all the remains. Yeah, I mean, it's. They talk further, and also, I mean, if you want to get really gruesome, I didn't go through it, but there's 20 some photos of the house online.
Yeah,
There's a
I
lot
don't
of
do
stuff you can
those.
find.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you're interested, you've already done so. But
I don't do that. Like I don't like the photos, and I don't like the 911 calls with crimes and stuff. Like that's just too much, and it feels like very intrusive to me. Like I find the stories interesting and the psychology interesting and like how it all happened, but like when you start gawking at like the actual gore of it and like the tragedy of it and hearing these people, that's too much for me. It's like, ugh.
So there was also, so while he only officially killed these two women, he stole, countless bodies, but there was also reports of other missing people. And in a town of, this small, there can't be that many serial killers, right? So there's an 8-year-old, a 15-year-old, and then 2 deer hunters that all went missing around this time frame. And their body parts weren't discovered in his house, and he never admitted to killing any of them. But it is interesting that they're, again, like the same time he's an active killer and he's going in these days like states. So maybe he truthfully doesn't remember it or didn't remember doing it,
Right.
or maybe somebody else did it.
Well, and then there's this lady that I alluded to before, I think, that we were talking about. Other thing, her name was Evelyn Hartley, and she went disappearing in 1953, and she was 15 when she went missing. But there's no evidence really, and he denied it, so it never went anywhere. But you talk about coincidences in crime that aren't usually coincidences. Right when she went missing, Ed Gein was visiting remains at like 2 blocks from where her house was. Like so, or visiting remains, visiting family. Sorry, I'm still in the graphic and gross. But he was visiting to like 2 blocks from where she disappeared at the time that she disappeared. So that one to me seems uh, like seems pretty likely that he might be involved in this. It could be completely a coincidence, but that's like you got this prolific, messed up person right next to where this woman goes missing. It's pretty likely, I'd say.
So he's of course he's arrested. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's obvious that he killed these two women and is crazy. Now, it, the crazy term is pretty apt here because
Yeah.
this it's suggested during the trial that he plead not guilty by reason of insanity. He went through a number of psychological tests
Yeah.
and concluded that he was indeed emotionally impaired. So
Yeah.
obviously, like
He's
somebody skinning people and tanning their bodies and wearing
yeah.
flesh is not, in the right mind. I mean, killing somebody, you have to be right.
Right. But like legally, they're the only that for legal insanity, you have to not understand what you're doing was wrong, I believe, like
Right.
in court cases. So that's like a different thing than being, of course, it's making furniture out of people is insane. But like if you knew that the world thinks that that's not right, and what you have to sneak around and not do this so people like hide it and stuff, that shows legal sanity. And I don't think like from what we're seeing about his crime spree, I think he probably was legally insane because he didn't really make any efforts to hide it. He's pulling a lady in a sled for a few miles and he just like walks in and takes the shopkeeper with his name on the last receipt. It's not like it doesn't seem very calculated. He's just kind of acting. So I think that's probably why he got to be classified as legally insane.
Yeah. I'm just going through like his how they describe him a little bit further. I mean, they classified him as schizophrenic and a sexual psychopath, which is kind of
Yeah, that's a dated, like terrible term, but yeah,
yeah.
like, but he's
Um,
definitely got some unresolved issues that manifested in very awful ways.
They also said that they found multiple other bodies on his property, which could have been these other missing people over the years. But he's like, no, not me.
Mhm.
Wasn't But and who knows, what he if they all even made it back to his house. But yeah, a number of people were never found in this time frame, which is just fascinating. I think.
Yeah,
Um, so because there's no one like him, this fascinated then to all the psychiatric community, in the world. This is a time when people are really like they're just kind of playing jazz here. They don't really
yeah,
understand like mental health at all.
yeah.
I
This
mean,
is
at the
very
time,
early. Yeah,
like at the time, being gay or trans or anything like that was considered you were insane. Like
yeah,
those were
yeah,
crimes. Those were crimes in a lot of places, which is just
yeah,
insane.
and they had, and they just. I mean, we've all seen the photos and videos of like mental institutions at the point they just lock them in cages and let them like excrete everywhere, and they cut parts of their brain and lobotomize them and electroshock. This is pretty terrible time for people with mental illnesses
Yeah, I
and
mean,
the people that were like you were saying, like people that weren't mentally ill but they were outside of what society at that time wanted, so they were classified as mentally ill. So it was awful.
so so they put him in a mental hospital for 30 days. He was evaluated
Hmm.
and determined to be mentally incompetent, so he couldn't stand trial for the murders.
Well, he did
Um,
though, eventually, right?
well, yeah, this is we'll get there. We'll get there.
Oh, sorry.
But so the people in the the 400 people or 5 people in the town around him were pissed. The
Right.
town is like covered in not only like psychiatrists, but media from around the country and also other police jurisdictions because they're all like trying to learn from what's happening here, and how this could happen and offer
Right.
their support and whatever.
And you think that if any police in that general area had any missing people, like missing women, that they'd be all over this place and all over this guy just to see.
Well, curious people came to the town, and people started selling and auctioning off his stuff from the house.
Yeah.
So they auctioned off his car, some of his furniture, musical instruments, and things like that. Um,
Yeah, that's pretty disturbing to me too. Like, people are really weird.
yeah, I think just what the fuck? Like, why, man?
Yeah.
Um, and then not even a year, about 6 months later, the police or fire department was called to Eddie's farm. His house was on fire. The house
Mhm.
quickly burned to the ground. Onlookers watched as you know all of his stuff was bye bye. This
Mhm.
museum, they called it. What did they call it? The Museum of the Morbid is what they called the Ed Gein's house. Um, and yeah, so most everything was destroyed, but
Yeah.
like I said, they did auction off some weird shit, which is just so bizarre to me.
Yeah.
Um,
I do. I also see here that after the house was burned, they told Geen, and his only reaction was to shrug and say, "Just as well." So,
I mean, I didn't care.
yeah.
So, 10 years in the institution, he was now considered fit to stand trial. So, 10 years after he murdered these women, well, more than that, because one of them he
Yeah.
murdered in the early
Yeah.
50s. Yeah. So, I mean, 10, 15 years later, he's finally able to stand trial to determine whether he's guilty or not. And it's like, what? What? They have photos of these dead women in his house. What do you mean if
Yeah.
he's guilty or not?
Yeah.
Um,
Like, legal system's weird sometimes.
yeah. So a lot of the people that stood trial, because there wasn't any like firsthand witnesses, ended up being like lab techs who performed the autopsies. um and I mean, obviously they had enough evidence, and within a
Well,
week
and
they
he,
were able to
yeah,
reach the verdict.
and he
um
confessed too. So
yeah, I
there's
mean,
that.
it wasn't tough. It was yeah. So
The defense was just shrugging, like, but
I think they only found him was found to have been insane at the time of the killing. He was later not found not guilty by reason of insanity and acquitted for that. And the trial, he was escorted back to the hospital for the criminally insane.
yeah. So
So
basically,
he's
they had to find him guilty of the crime, but then say that we can't send him to prison because he's crazy.
yeah.
So we're sending him to state hospital. Yeah.
Yep. So that's where he stayed, in the hospital, this mental institution, for the rest of his life, which was about a little less than 20 years from this time frame. But he just kind of hung out and did his psychiatry stuff, and like,
Oh, and lung cancer. So
well, he did keep building. He was a stone polisher, a rub maker. Yeah, he just did weird shit there, as you do. He made ham
you just do
radios.
crafts. Yeah. He probably made a lot of like dream catchers, like by
Yeah,
like craft time. But yeah, he died on July 26, 1984. So we're
they said
connected
he
that
was.
way. I
Yeah,
wonder
they
what I
said
did
he.
for my birthday that year.
Yeah, I don't know. But
I don't know.
yeah, that's it. That's Ed Gein's life and death. Um, but I mean, he lived to 84, so he was
77, it says. Yeah.
77. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good
It's
life.
a long,
I mean, if you could
it's a
live that
long,
long,
crazy life.
you did it. Yeah. So
I mean,
this
even
is
now, it's still like a respect. I mean, you're still kind of young now at 77, but no one's going to be like super shocked if someone at 77 passes. Still kind of young now, though, right? Like, you'd be,
yeah. I mean,
like,
it's crazy.
people,
Like, his superintendent of the institution even said, if all our patients were as docile as Ed Gein, we'd have no trouble here at all.
that's what I
What?
mean. Like, we're talking about the days and stuff. I don't like the days he gets in. I don't know. Like, just
Just
so, like,
just a
his
weird time.
yeah. He was
Yeah.
just so abused and like so, like, he never had a shot. His synapses were all wrong, and then he never got to deal with the grief of his mother. Just, I mean, I'm not letting the guy off the hook. He should have been locked away forever because you can't do that, and that's awful. Fuck that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, he never had a chance from like his birth, really. So, not to be sympathetic of a killer, but this is kind of the mold that this is the archetype of an American killer, I think, that we
Yeah.
eventually see explode in the
Mhm.
70s. I mean, you see that 60s, 70s, but really the early 70s, you see a lot of white men that have very confused conceptions of what gender is and what sexuality is and the treatment of women, and they're all very similar, and it's very scary in that time. Like, really only in the last 20 years, like I would say, like, young white men especially are really understanding like what it means to be anybody but you, and how to sympathize and react and understand other cultures and genders. And but that, what a terrifying time, like 60s to 70s, to be, you're being raised under the guise of a lot of like religious scrutiny, I guess, and what that does to people and what that does to their minds.
And that's what I mean by the comparison. Like, it's no excuse. I didn't have a father, and I was raised by a mother, and I had a hard childhoods too. My mother was great. Like, she did her best, but she was very like religious, like zealot, and was a little harsh sometimes. And it's just strange. It's just strange what creates that. Like you're mentioning the domineering like mother and like the abusive father or the absent father, and like just off the top of my head, like Ed Kemper, Ted Bundy both fit into that. And I don't know, it's just strange that there's these communal like similarities between these men.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's I guess we could do an episode that's just kind of talking about like the serial killer archetype at this time, because it is pretty fascinating. I think because there is a mold really, but this is such a prolific and interesting case, and it is sad, like, to hear like a child just like fully mentally and physically abused and taught, like what he was being taught is abuse, like,
Yeah.
and how that creates the type of person it creates is just, it sucks obviously for him, but the unfortunate people who had died at the hands of
Yeah,
his
I mean,
personality. But
yeah, let's not forget the victims here. Like, they're
yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, but very quickly there was inspiration, like Hitchcock a few years later. Well, I don't know, I never read the book Psycho is based
yeah,
off
I
of.
didn't either. I haven't either. I don't know what year
So
that was published.
yeah, because it's called, what is the book called? Is it
I think
called
it's still
Psycho?
just Psycho. Yeah, still Psycho. 1959. So it wasn't too long. Like, Ed
Yeah,
Gein
so
hadn't gone to trial yet. So
yeah, but I think all the stuff was out then, because that
yeah,
was
it was.
57 and 58. So
Yeah. So this could be a direct response, really.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a pretty similar adaptation, of a boy and his mother. This is obviously
Yeah, like
done a
the
little
plot of the
bit.
book, according to Wikipedia, starts just Norman Bates, a middle-aged bachelor, is dominated by his mother, a mean-tempered, puritanical old woman who forbids him to have a life outside of her. So yeah, so seems like pretty closely related there.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, because I mean the book is, I guess, pretty similar, but it is, I mean, 2 years later, and it's a short book. I mean, I think it's only a couple hundred. It's 185 pages. So, I mean, you don't really have to get that crazy, but or I mean, in depth with what's actually happening, because it's pretty straightforward. And I think when they do the movie, it increases. But yeah, it looks like
I'll have to read this. That'll be fun.
Oh, the writer of the book was living 35 miles away from Plainfield.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
He
So yeah,
said,
he's just
unaware at the time of Ed Gein's case, he began writing with the quote notion that the man next door may be a monster unsuspected, even in the gossiping ridden microcosm of a small town. The novel, I mean, I think he kind of inadvertently went back and kind of adjusted it. He said Block discovered how closely the imagery character he created resembled the real life Ed Gein, both overt and apparent motivation. But I mean, that's like the 1959 way of saying like, no, this is an original idea. It's like, motherfucker, you live 35 miles away.
Yeah.
You absolutely knew what you were doing.
That's that like all like similarities to real people or completely whatever the movies say at the end.
Yeah,
That's his version.
absolutely.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating, I think, look at a serial killer, and you can see why there's inspiration both in the novel and in the movies. Like, it makes a good villain, and what makes a good villain is being able to relate and have some level of sympathy. And I think that's done best in Psycho, but then, most terrifying in Texas Chainsaw, which took another 10 years to really take the, human skin masks and lampshades and things
Yeah.
like that. And then, I mean, really you get it split over the three movies, because then you have Buffalo Bill, who's, kind of a combination, maybe the closest to actually
Yeah,
being
he's
Ed
kind of
Gein.
he's kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of serial killers, though.
Bad
Buffalo
Boys.
Bill. Yeah. Bad
Uh,
Boys.
Well, so we'll get into that in the next episode, kind of what the inspiration is. We can talk a little bit more about the book. Shit, I could read 180 pages in an hour probably. So maybe we can
Are you
both.
bragging? You just bragged.
I can't read that fast, but I'll listen to it on tape. I don't have the mental capacity.
Set tape only.
Yeah, but we'll talk in depth about how these murders relate to those. Well, there's more than just those, but just pop culture in general, because just the adaptation of this is an interesting thing in and of itself. But
And why creative people kind of latched on to this idea? Like, that's interesting to me. So,
well, we did it. We discussed the horrible Plainfield butcher, Ed Gein.
mhm.
What are we gonna call him now? Ed Gein.
I like that. Yeah, it should be. It's either guy. If you're German, it'd be Gein, like 9, right? Like no. And then
I like it.
I always thought it was gain.
Ed
That's what
Gein.
happens when you read a lot of books. You don't hear people like say things. You just mispronounce everything.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's my childhood right there.
Well, we did it. This has been an
We did it.
hour-long podcast, Eric.
We did it. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be back next week with part 2 of the inspirations from Ed Gein. And the hour may be over, but the clock keeps ticking, my friend. This was the Nightmare Hour podcast. Oh, don't forget, you can like and tell your friends all about this podcast. If you want to give us a suggestion for a topic or a movie to cover, or a real life supernatural or not so real life serial killer. Wait,
or just natural. Yeah. Natural or
you can email us at nightmarehourpod@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the social media. Pretty easy to find. Just look up Nightmare Hour. And that's it, I think, right?
I think so, yeah.
All right.
Sorry this was so graphic and gross.
Yeah, we'll do some fun stuff in December. Whatever that means.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, we'll see you next week for part 2. Thanks, Eric. As always, it's been a pleasure hanging out.
I know. I miss you.
All right.
This was good.
This was great.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.
Yep. Bye.